Greeting viewers, thank you for joining us. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi warmly welcomes you, our dear audience members, to the continuation of the African Book Talk series. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi is part of 9 regional hubs positioned around the world by Columbia University. The centers serve as platforms for dialogue and the exchange of knowledge in research, education, as well as public programming. Today we have Dr. Kwan Kew Lai back here with us to speak about her second book, which covers memories of her work in Africa. Into Africa, Out of Academia, a Doctor's Memoir, covers the story of how Dr. Lai left her full position as a professor in the United States to provide medical humanitarian aid to the remote villages and war-torn areas of Africa. The memoir follows her experiences from 2006 to 2013, where she provided care during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, after natural disasters, and as a relief doctor in refugee camps in Kenya, Libya, Uganda, and South Sudan. Dr. Lai is a Harvard Medical Faculty physician specializing in infectious diseases. She is also a disaster relief medical volunteer who has volunteered her medical services worldwide. She treated Ebola patients in Liberia and Sierra Leone during the greatest Ebola outbreak in Africa, and volunteered in Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, New York, and on the US Virgin Island of St. Croix during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Lai has received numerous awards for her work, including being a third-time recipient of the President's Volunteer Service Award. Our moderator is our dear friend and colleague, Jennifer Dawn, who is a director of the Office of Global Initiatives and an assistant professor at Columbia Nursing School, where she teaches community health. Jennifer also oversees the collaboration between Columbia Nursing and Columbia Global Centers and leads the Columbia Nursing World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Advanced Practice Nursing. For over a decade at ICAP, Jennifer worked to improve the infrastructure for nurses and nurse midwives in 12 sub-Saharan African countries. As we begin, kindly note that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. As we proceed, remember to post your questions under the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens there. For more information, informative programs, remember to follow us on our social media platforms. My colleague Sandra is posting our handles in the chat section. Jennifer, you're most welcome to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. Greetings to Marugi, greetings to all of the people at the Columbia Global Centers in Nairobi. And I hope to be back there soon. It's so wonderful to be doing this and very excited to be discussing your new book, Dr. Lai, with you today. I see us as sister travelers. You as a medical doctor who's, as was described by Pauline, have put yourself on the front lines in many catastrophic situations. Your book went into out of academia is really a challenge, I think, in a very appropriate, healthy way to academics about what we can do with our knowledge in terms of being of use and aiding peoples around the world. My journey has been one as a midwife and nurse practitioner, and my work has taken me to many of the countries that you've been at different times. I'm surprised we've never crossed paths, but to get to hear your story is really also for me a reflection of my own work and what I can do, and a challenge to me to do more. So thank you. It's really an honor to be with you today and exciting to have this platform for discussion. And I hope our paths now cross more directly. So I want to start off by saying, just asking you, what drives your work? What your own journey to get to the place where you were knew you had to leave academia, take leave from your family, and go off and do the things that you have done, where you borne witness and provided direct aid in medical services. So maybe tell me about your own fire in you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to, first of all, thank the Columbia Global Center in Nairobi, Kenya, for letting me to have this platform to discuss my experiences in Africa. I also like to thank you, Jennifer, for agreeing to moderate the session. And then I'd like to thank the various people who are from all over the world listening in. And I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you for spending some time with us. And if you had attended the first book talk that I did a few weeks ago on my book on Ebola, I hope you will pardon me for repeating what I said about how I started to become a volunteer. I actually was born in a very poor family in Penang, Malaysia, halfway across the world from here. And it was under the British colonial period for some time, for close to 200 years. And so when I was in the island of Penang in Malaya, we have very few books to use. Until when I was around 12, my teacher from secondary school decided that he would take us on a field trip to visit United States Information Service. And there they had a huge library. And they said we could borrow books from the library with a free library card. So that was my entrance into seeing the world. And in the library, I started to read quite avidly, and I learned about Dr. Tom Dooley and his humanitarian work in Laos and Vietnam. And my friend who was in school with me, she was more lucky. She had a lot of books, and she told me about Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who went to Africa to set up a hospital for the poor. These two men inspired me, and I thought at some point in my life, I needed to do something to help people. In that same library, in my secondary school years, I researched in that library to look for a university or college in the United States that would offer me scholarship to go to school. And after months of research, I eventually got accepted to Wellesley College, which is a very prestigious school in the Northeast. And they offered me a full scholarship to go to school. That was an open gate for me to advance my dream. And Wellesley has a college motto that said, non ministrari sed ministrare, which means not to be ministered, but to minister. And so that motto really spurs me on to pay it forward, because someone extended a helping hand for me to further my education. So throughout all those years, I had thought about volunteering, but because, as you see, you have to have a family, you have to pay back your student loans and so forth. So I did not start to volunteer until the Asian tsunami hit Southeast Asia. And that was my very first medical volunteering. And that was a very intense experience. And when I came back, I thought to myself that that might be a time for me to think about doing some volunteering work. Unfortunately, as Jennifer, you know, in academia, you can't take time off. And the most time I could take off is 2 weeks. And so I decided that it's not something that I could sustain myself staying in academia and doing volunteering work. So I left, and since then I had been combining volunteering work with working part-time. And when I started volunteering, I found that the experiences I gained from volunteering made me want to volunteer even more. And I strongly feel that I receive more from the people I help than I give to them. So that is a very rewarding experience for me. And I really admire Nelson Mandela, and he has many words of wisdom. And one of the statements that he made was, what counts in life is not the mere facts that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. This is about sum up what I feel, how I feel about my volunteering experiences. So I hope that is not too long and not too boring for people to listen to.
I think all of it is fascinating and none of it is boring. It's so important because sometimes I'm often asked that question, why did you do this? And it's finding the roots of what draws us to make this commitment. Many people see it as a sacrifice. I see it as a very grateful thing that I get to do this. And I so appreciate what you said about academia, because I also had to take my vacation time and eventually had to leave. And now it's different. Now I actually run an office about global equity at Columbia University. So it's now I have full support finally to do what I want to do, which is to be a great breakthrough, and academics should be supported in doing that. So thank you. And very poignant words about Nelson Mandela, who's very dear to my heart and my family. So it's a real inspiration again about how what stirs us to do things. So let's talk about some specific examples from you of what you experience. And I'd like to have for this discussion, you look about the differences in protocols, for example, in HIV that you found and how people give care, what you learned about it. Maybe we could talk about your work in, around HIV in Tanzania and Uganda first, about being in that storm of HIV, right? Insurmountable mountains, even though you seem to climb mountains, insurmountable mountains, how you navigated this and learning different protocols and learning also what was adaptive. So maybe just an example or two, we'll talk about a couple of your different situations since your work is so broad and on so many different front lines.
Well, the first country I went to was Tanzania. And I had never seen a hospital in Africa. So when I saw the first hospital I've been to, which is built in 1964, I was almost floored by the fact that such a hospital with such difficult conditions exist. And I have to get used to the kind of things that people have to deal with, have to live with. And I admire the healthcare workers that I work with who would do a lot of things with very little that they have. And they seem to be quite happy with what they had. And as you said about the protocol, we were much advanced in HIV treatment at the time when I arrived in Tanzania. And they were only given a very limited protocol in which they had to abide by. And the medications that they were given, they were medications that we had abandoned in US because they were found to have more side effects on the patients. In fact, one of the medications made the patients appear to be so uniquely thin in certain parts of the body that they became like a stigma for the patients, that they were more or less, people could tell they're HIV infected because they displayed the side effects of the medication. But given that, they had no other choices. So they had this medication that they had to deal with. And I quickly learned that this was what we had. We had nothing else to offer us. And the best we could do is to tell the patients to take the medications religiously so they could improve their CD4 or the immune function. And I noticed that the healthcare workers work really hard they have a lot of patience to tell the the patients to adhere to their regimen. And the patients, to me, in America, tend to ask a lot of questions, but the patients there were accepting of the fact that that was the regimen and you had to come in once every 30 days to receive your medications. And that was an onerous thing for lots of patients because they travel long distances and they had to take time off from work to do this kind of traveling to a clinic once every 30 days so they could receive the medications. That was quite a lot of hardship for the people there. And also certain centers did not have the capacity to follow the immune function, the CD4 count. And so a lot of centers had to accept what WHO standard of following immune functions. So there were many, many shortcomings, and yet the people were able to adjust to the criteria that they have to use to treat patients with HIV. The other thing that I found very difficult for me to accept was very young children, after they had been put on regimen, they were sent on their own to the clinicians to receive the medications without adult supervision. And in the meantime, they were not told that they had HIV. And that kind of information was not given to them until they were much older. So they would go as a child to a clinic on their own to accept medications, to learn how to take the medications, as though they were adults, and yet they didn't know why they were taking the medications. That was something that was difficult for me to accept. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things that I have to get used to, things that I took for granted in US, but I didn't take care of children. So that was the time when I observed that these children would come quietly accepting their medications and then would walk home, which is maybe an hour walking back to their village.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think part of doing this work is really to be open and listening and to understand how different peoples and cultures approach all of these issues. Sometimes because of lack of resources and sometimes different cultural views. And so it's something that I'm glad you stressed you're doing this, because people oftentimes go in with what I call a very American attitude of, well, this is what you should do. And that's only an attitude because of cultures we live in that are actually not very successful in providing good health care for everyone. So it's a really important thing about respecting it. And I've been in many places where the struggle was really when children became teenagers and then learned their HIV status and how to negotiate that, and parents working that through with children as well as nurses and midwives. So let's switch to a very different situation so we can get a little bit of this whole vastness of what you do. Let's talk about Nakivale refugee camp in Uganda and serving those in forced migration. Again, a very different situation of being forced out of your home, your land, no time for preparation, family separated, and you being there to set up basic primary care.
Nakivale refugee camp is a little bit different from other refugee camps because it has been there in Nakivale for almost 20 years. So it is a very long-term camp that a lot of the refugees who had more education really wanted to leave the camp. The government in Uganda does not allow people to go out of the camp to go and work elsewhere or to get education. So they're kind of stuck in a refugee camp, which because of the chronic nature of the camp, it has schools for the children, it has clinics, and it has shops. So it's a kind of a self-contained community. And instead of tents in a refugee camp, you have houses, settlement that the people live in. They are given a piece of land to to grow crops, so they have something to sustain them for their daily living. So it is a settlement rather than a refugee camp. How, what their future is going to be like is quite difficult to determine. I would imagine that lots of people would like to get out of the camp, especially young people, to get more education. And I've known people who work for the clinic. UNHCR has given them scholarship so they could go out to start school and then to be able to come back to help the people. So the camps are very different from other refugee camps I have been to, which, for example, the camp that I was at in Uganda as well, neighboring the Democratic Republic of Congo. That was because there was a huge conflict that happened suddenly against the government. And so refugees just pour across the border to Rwanda and Uganda, and UNHCR had to go there quickly to set up temporary shelters. And so they have small tents, big tents, smaller tents for families, 2 families to share. The big communal tent is really for huge groups of people sleeping in cots in a big tent. So it's very different from Neki Valley. And the UNHCR made those makeshift tents temporary, and then they try to find other settlement to ship the people to other settlement to set up refugee camps. Eventually, I would imagine those refugee camps will turn out to be almost like a mini Neki Valley refugee camp, unless there are places that would accept them to resettle them into the community. But when I was there, there was no such resettlement plan. The resettlement plan is just to move them to another area in Uganda, so that the transient refugee camp next to the border was not overcrowded.
That raises big dilemmas as a healthcare provider, because you're dealing with many issues, some more immediate, nutrition, respiratory infections, and some much longer term issues, including mental health issues.
Yes.
Yes. And maybe you'd compare it a little bit. I know these are vastly different, but your time in Juba, South Sudan, I thought those, because that was, again, a situation of both conflict, people in transition and movement,
right.
All of it combined into a country that had minimal health resources ever established.
Juba is, well, we know South Sudan became a new country in 2011. So the newest country in Africa. But that was after they have over 20 years of civil war. And because of that, they had no time to really set up healthcare facilities. In fact, the existing healthcare facilities were so much ignored that by the time we went there, when war supposedly ended, the facilities themselves were pretty old, and infrastructure was bad, and very little medical supplies. The medical equipment was lacking. And lastly, the healthcare providers were few, just because there was no time for training, and it was all 20 plus years of conflict and war. In fact, there was a nursing school that was set up next door to Bantu. It was a very nice 2 buildings set up to teach the people in Juba, not Juba, north of Juba, to learn about nursing. And that had to be shut down because of the civil war. And so the buildings were becoming decrepit and very bad. And so there was a lot of stripping of the electrical equipment, whatever that was in the nursing school was stripped. So that was like they had to be back to square one to even set up something, a place for training. And so that was really devastating. South Sudan, we went at a time when there was practically very little thing that we could work with. There were health centers, but they had to be rehabilitated to clean up and to maybe supply with medicine and equipment as well as personnel. So that was a huge job. And we were trying to get baseline data to see what could be done. Unfortunately, the conflict, even though the country became a new country, the internal conflict continued. So there was no stability for any of the healthcare people at the top trying to set up primary care clinic. If you don't have stability, you cannot do it. And on top of that, there was a lot of back and forth between the government in Khartoum, the Sudan government, and South Sudan about how much money they could get from the oil revenue. And South Sudan was in a very difficult position because they have the oil, but they have no oil refinery and they have no way to export the oil because it is a landlocked country. So it had to depend on Sudan to help them with refining as well as exporting their oil. So there was just a lot of negotiation. How much would you give me so I could help you with your oil production?
Right.
So the economy was really so much dependent on the oil that it was kind of strapped by the conflicts.
So and it's always true what you're saying is healthcare is so dependent on the larger system around us and all the interactions and what we can do. Can you just go through like a day where you woke up when you were working in South Sudan? Let's take this example because I'd like people listening to understand a little bit better what a day was like for you, where you woke up, what you ate, what you did, and then how you gave medical care. What did you try and do?
It was difficult in South Sudan because we were doing mobile clinic. The very first place we went to actually had a clinic that we could go to provide care. And we had a good place to stay, comparatively good place to stay. And then we could walk over next door to the clinic to do work. Unfortunately, when we looked at the pharmacy supply, there weren't a lot of things that we could give the patients, including oral rehydration and solution. There was none, which is very basic, but we didn't have that. And the medical team that I went to was not supply. Usually when I travel with a medical team, we try to take medicine with us as well. But this particular group, we did not take medicine with us. So we have to teach people how to make oral rehydration solution, hoping that they will boil their water first. So that was the first thing that you have to do. So it was really hard to provide proper medical care without medicine. The other places we went to, we would be getting up in the morning. Whether we could have breakfast or not is another matter. Sometimes there was no breakfast, so we had to contend with maybe water or whatever that we have with us. Then we travel usually for 3 hours or so to a center. So that was not good roads. There were a lot of potholes and muddy conditions. So we would go to a clinic 3 hours later. We would find out the clinical conditions not conducive to setting up a clinic. Would end up setting up a clinic under a tree or somewhere outside so we could see the patients with some screens that we brought with us. So it was pretty makeshift. Again, medicines were in short supply. So that was one thing that kind of struck us trying to take care of the patients. That would be we will start after 3 hours of traveling. We'll go through lunch hour without lunch break, and we will see patients as long as there were patients to be seen. And all we could do was just drink sips of water. We would see patients till maybe 3:30 or 4:30, and then we will gather up our equipment and then we would leave. We actually had to bring chairs and tables and things like that of our own to set up a clinic under a tree or someplace like that. And then we'll just drive back for 3 hours to where we were staying. And how we got dinner is usually up in the air. Maybe we'll see an eatery on the way and we'll go there and have some dinner. And then we settle for the night. You know, the latrine, we have maybe 1 or 2 latrine, maybe 1 stall to take a bucket bath. That's about all. So we didn't really have luxurious places to stay, but that was part of the adventure, is to do that kind of thing. And I really didn't mind that. And I thought it was challenges that we faced that compared to what the people that we are helping face, they are quite minuscule. They are insignificant, what they had to face, the difficult situations day after day, which we really going there maybe for weeks and months, we really didn't have to live with this kind of condition. So we should be able to tolerate whatever conditions that we are placed in.
Right. And I think you lead me into another point to discuss is what you learn, what we learn from the people in the communities we serve, how they're dealing with their crises. About health and all, I had the real honor of working for a period of time in East London, South Africa, for a group called Mothers to Mothers, and it was a non-governmental organization, and they hired women who were pregnant, who were HIV positive, to be the people to mentor women into treatment. And this was in 2006. So limited, again, antiretroviral treatment, but definitely treatment. And just the start, just the turning point from denialism and no treatment to nevirapine to triple regimen treatment. And everything I might have thought about how you reach out to people, what you learn was completely changed by watching these very heroic women stand up in a courtyard or outside or inside a clinic space and address 50 pregnant women saying, I'm HIV positive and you need to find out your status and we can get help and you can have a healthy baby and you can be healthy. And they faced stigma in their communities. They were really the change makers, and they forced the nurses and the doctors to think very differently, that there was no accepting what they had, that they wanted it all. And they really pushed in South Africa. They pushed nurses to really, who were doing almost all the work, to organize an important struggle for NIMART, nurse-initiated managed ART care, because nurses were giving the frontline care and needed to change the balance of who would get in. So it's interesting. I've learned so much about how communities force us to change in very needed ways, and then bigger forces to change the whole system about what we can do. Do you have any examples of that? I know they're in your book. Maybe one comes to mind where you really saw, out of any of your experiences, communities really being the people that you learned from.
Well, the first country I went to, Tanzania, I'm kind of impressed by the fact that 90% of the patients who attended clinic were women, maybe 10% men, and they were quite reluctant to test their status for HIV. They tended to say that they were not the person to bring HIV to the family. So it was the woman who brought HIV to the family. The women in Tanzania that I met, as you say, they were stigmatized, and they were the people who were the leaders, and they formed groups to go to the villages to talk about with other women to come forward to get HIV testing. they were shunned by some members of the community, and yet they were brave enough to do that on their own without compensation. So that I met groups of women doing that, going to villages to give support to other women. And some women even set up centers for women to come in to talk about their pregnancy and to talk about HIV testing. So I am very impressed by African women who, to me, are very brave women who handle a lot of difficult situations. In all the countries I've been to, women were left with taking care of children, picking up the pieces, including grandmothers who children die from HIV, leaving orphans, their orphaned grandchildren for them to take care of. So they are the people who really take care of the next generation. In all places I've been to, women seem to be the one who really pick up the heavy burden of bringing up the next generation. In fact, when I was in Kenya, there was this woman who set up a micro finance program for the villages. And they're not a lot of money, maybe $200, $400 US. The women would come forward. And in fact, almost 100% of the applicants for the microfinance program were women. And the men, one of the men told the person who set it up, your money is too little. we need more money to set up a big business. But these women were just thinking of bringing up their children, small little business that they could sell something in the village, and then they could then bring up the children. And they are also quite responsible in paying back the loans. They make sure that the money will be there to help other people to be on their feet. So that is the kind of thing that I found very impressive. Everywhere I turned would be women who would even deliver their own babies at home, given the clean razor, clean stitches, whatever they had to do. They would deliver their own children at home and would come back for treatment or for follow-up. It's amazing what they can do.
Yes. Yes, we do carry the world, and if you want an example, the ones you showed are perfect about what's put on. Used to be a saying, women in South Africa were the most tested and the least treated. And pregnancy was certainly the entryway to get people into the system to get tested for HIV and on to treatment. And I think that the women themselves that mobilized in the communities to push this, to get full treatment and access to standards that were acceptable around the world are really heroes that are unacknowledged oftentimes. And why I like the stories that you told in the book is you could see who was doing this and who were the champions and should be given much more support in our strategies for healthcare and our strategies involving them as that link. So it leads right into this. I want to talk a little bit about inequity and how you see the roots of the current situations in many African countries. Paul Farmer, the late Paul Farmer, who's certainly in my eyes a champion of human rights and of peoples everywhere. His latest book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History, he really dissects brilliantly in 600 pages, fully documented the centuries of colonialism and its pillaging of resources and enslavement of people, particularly in many African countries, and the resulting legacy of inequity that keeps getting perpetuated. There was minimal investment ever in healthcare systems. So countries post-liberation from colonialism still have had to carry incredible repercussions, and we're looking at specifically healthcare. And I just want your reflection on that, because you raised the question many times in your book about what is causing all of this that you're seeing. Why is it so different? Global, I use the terms global north, global south, but I don't know what your understanding is. And I think it's very important, since it's ripples on what we can do in supporting a different approach for going forward in being participants, not drivers of building healthcare systems. Yeah. Big question, but I know you think a lot about this. So, and I teach a lot about it. So I'm opening it to you.
If you read my book, I grapple with your problems that you raise very often. And I really have no good answers for these problems. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that the international arena has poured in tons of money for decades into developing countries. And yet some countries thrive, some countries don't. And, I'm from Southeast Asia, and I've seen a country like Singapore. Singapore was under British for close to 200 years, like my island. And yet now Singapore is really not third world anymore. And it has been able to advance so much. And yet many other nations who gained independence in the 50s and the 60s from the colonial power have not reached the state that Singapore has reached. So I don't understand what all the reasons are, but one of the things that I think about is instability. So much conflict, externally, internally, in many countries in Africa, have caused them to slow down their progress. They are unable to concentrate on building their economy, setting up good healthcare system for the people that really need the healthcare system. And that is maybe part of the problem, and why people get involved in so much conflict. Maybe there's so many tribal tribulations, disagreements. It's really beyond my thinking. How you solve it, why we have them all the time, and there seems to be no resolution to all these conflicts. Looking at South Sudan, after 25 years of conflict, they had an agreement, and yet after all this agreement, they would go into more conflict. And so there's no end to it. And the DRC similarly have so many conflicts that I'm not sure how people have a peaceful time to be able to build out a nation that is good for the people. The other thing that I think about is corruption, which is quite common. Even back in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of corruption. And I don't think I'm the person to know the inside of corruption, but when I was in Sierra Leone, I heard about money that was slated for Ebola outbreak disappeared into somebody's pockets, and nobody could pinpoint where it went. And that was beyond my human mind to say that that money was to save a lot of people's lives, and yet someone had the notion that that money belonged to him, and that's it. There's no more money for people to fight Ebola. There are many instances like that. When I was living long-term in Malawi, and newspapers would talk about corruption here, corruption there, and it's really fairly rampant, especially with money that are slated for improving the nation. The money somehow mysteriously disappear. no one can account for where the money went. So it was part of the reason that corruption is not a good thing for many nations. The other thing that I find it very difficult to understand is the tendency to stay in power for decades, for the people up there not to be able to come to terms with limitation in their governance, but they seem to want to prolong it to 30 years, 40 years, whatever they think the leadership was good for. I think that is not healthy for many nations, because you really need some new minds and new talents to run the country. So to have a person ruling for years, which makes it almost like a dictator regime, is not good for any nation at all. So that's part of the reason that I think it might be a bad thing for many countries. So those are some of the things that I kind of punt around and said maybe these are some of the reasons, but how do you solve them? How do you get rid of these things? And the other thing about cronism, recently Mugabe was grabbing lots of land from landowners and giving it to friends and families who had no idea how to farm. So making the country into, rather than a rice bowl, to be devastated in famine and lacking of food. So that is kind of a governance that was really bad for any nation.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for your honesty, because I do see you grappling with it throughout the book, trying to make sense of it, of which sometimes there is no way to make sense. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing direct day-to-day the repercussions on human lives. Mm-hmm. And that's yes.
One time that I spoke to someone in Nairobi, he turned around and said to me that we are part of the problem because we give aid so much that the African countries become dependent on aid. And so we are part of the problem. And he kind of turned the table on me, and I thought about it. He had a point, and yet at the same time, I don't think we can turn off aid completely, because African nations do need aid. And how do we get rid of dependency is another question that I could not answer. And he said to me that international communities give us money, so we become dependent, and the leaders would not do anything because he said outside countries can help us. Mm-hmm. So that's the point that he made, and I don't know what to think about it.
Right. Well, corruption is certainly a universal situation. I mean, the papers, the New York Times every day is revealing another scandal of who took money from the COVID aid. So this country is certainly has many examples of it. I feel when we go down to the issue of affecting healthcare, which is what you and I do, that's our lives, and that's where we are, that there's one framework that I thought was very important, and it's again from Paul Farber, and he spoke about this right during the Ebola, when you were there in Liberia and Sierra Leone. He talked about this, our minds, meaning Western, global North, healthcare providers and people, have a socialization of scarcity, which means we get socialized into saying, well, people don't have the resources, so we can't do the same treatments. And it's a very dangerous place to be. It's what happened first in the whole battle with pharmaceuticals to reduce the cost of antiretroviral treatments so that people could get them. Certainly when I was in South Africa, the struggle was about people demanding triple therapy, not happy with no treatment or one drug or one regimen, which you said might not be the best regimen at all, or have no flexibility, or have huge side effects. But it was the pharmaceuticals preventing people from governments being unable to pay. So people actually, countries like India and Brazil developed their own pharmaceuticals and sold them cheaply, and that forced the prices down. But the underlying argument was people, this used to make me crazy, people in South Africa would not know how to take the antiretroviral treatment drugs, which is such a colonialist, imperialist, whatever we want to call it, view. Anyone can learn to take them, and especially everyone has a cell phone. There's constant creative ways to remind people when it's time to use it. So I feel the same thing happened in the whole debate about oral treatment versus IV treatment for Ebola. What resources were there? And there's not any easy answer, because you end up doing what you can with the resources you have. But it's an important framework to say, don't get socialized into thinking, well, people don't have this, so we won't consider it. And I think we see it getting repeated with the whole, many people call vaccine apartheid, with the non-distribution equitably across the world of COVID vaccines when they first came out, right? 90% of shots went into global north people's arms. This can't be right, but we, in a day-to-day way, you on the front line face this and face having to say, there is nothing I can give you. That's a huge dilemma and burden unjustly on the people wanting the rights to the highest level of health, and you being the provider saying there's nothing. So any other reflections on that? I just thought you approached this many times in your book. And this, you honestly just answered, no easy answers, right? No easy answers to say, we just did this and it'll be all okay. There aren't any, but that being aware of that and the injustice of it all, I think is part of certainly what drives me to do it differently. And I feel like your passion and commitment to doing this is driving you. I might be wrong, but it's what I see when I read your book.
Well, WHO always has a role in trying to make things equitable. So I do not think that the leaders in African countries could do that. And the chapter on Nigeria, I kind of emphasize the fact that Nigeria is a very oil-rich country. And yet when you look at the healthcare portion of their economy that is contributed by the government is very small. Almost like 80% of the healthcare expenditure come from international aid. And so the nation itself does not really contribute that much to building a good healthcare system for the people, despite the fact that it's an oil-rich country. So that just looking at a fairly rich country with good resources, that country is struggling with providing good healthcare system for the people. And so it's still dependent on outside help. Why is that so? It's hard for me to say, because even in Nigeria, the northern part of Nigeria is so much in turmoil and under rebel control as well, that it's really difficult for the government to go there to set up any good healthcare system. But besides that, the southern part is really under the government control, and yet that's where I went to look at HIV/AIDS care, and you still have unequal care even in the southern part, which is relatively peaceful. I have no good answer to how you can do that. I mean, I certainly applaud India, countries that have tried to lower the prices of the HIV meds or other medications. But I have also noticed that when I was in Africa, big pharmacology corporations such as Merck or Gilead, they had given free medications for the clinics that I worked in. So those are free things that are given to the people that a lot of people in the US don't know anything about. I don't think they advertise it that much, but they do contribute to trying to make their, whatever they call it, contribution from their company to help the people in Africa. Things like that we actually don't know. And also think about PEPFAR. Very few people talk about PEPFAR, which is a program that we as United citizens should be proud of, because it's a program that really helped to save lots of lives from AIDS and HIV. And we as a nation had contributed billions of dollars to fight one disease. And so a lot of us have no idea that we did that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised PEPFAR, because I had the responsibility of the directing the largest grant from PEPFAR for nursing in 5 sub-Saharan African countries, which was later expanded around HIV care education. And what was brilliant to me about the grant was that the money went directly to nursing schools in those countries. And it was decided by the nursing councils and gathering of the schools themselves how they would divide up the money. And so it was really led right into, the money went to, it didn't have 6 places to go through and everyone needing their piece of it, went right directly into the nursing schools. I mean, I remember being in a mountaintop in Lesotho at a nursing school there, and the sister there who ran the school, very tiny school, incredibly excellent school in terms of nursing curriculum. When we said, well, how are you going to set up finances to manage this $5 million? And she pulled out her checkbook and she said, well, I'm not really sure. So part of it went to building. She could manage, build a little finance department, and then apply for other. Anyway, the money went into the hands. And I think that's one of the brilliant parts of what happened in the piece of PEPFAR I worked for. So I know we're nearly out of time, but I want to switch before we do questions. I want to switch to a very different piece that I started talking with you before we went on the air here. And that's about how we sustain ourselves for the work we do. How do we, at the end of that day, when you might get dinner and you haven't eaten all day, or you've just seen, in my case, women die in labor, which I don't see very much in this country because of HIV and inability, early days of HIV in South Africa. I never saw this many women die before in labor, giving birth. So how do we find our sustaining peace? And one thing that jumps out so strongly in your book is your relationship to the land. From your jogging through the community and as it happened every day, the kids joining and shouting at you, waving at you as you jog, and also climbing things that I could barely read about, that you were on the top there of mountains, Mount Margarita in Uganda, really the top of Kilimanjaro. Talk a little for all of us, because it seems to me that part of your nourishment comes again from absolutely loving the land, and it's challenged. I mean, you could have gone in on your time off, rested and ate well and slept before you went to your next site. And said she's on a mountaintop, and people are saying you can't go to the top. And Dr. Lai is saying, I think we're going to the top, and up you went. You know, it just is incredible force in you. So just maybe a few words, and then we can look if we have any questions.
I think that it is very important to get some exercise every single time that you go volunteering. So no matter where I had been, like even in Libya during the war, I went running. So I just make sure that it was safe for me to do. So, and that really kind of decreases stresses that I face. And getting close to nature is what I really like. And I think that is very important. And I feel like Africa is so beautiful, and there's so many places that people don't know about, because we see on the news crowding, poverty, conflicts, wars. We should know that parts of Africa that we don't go to because it's difficult to go to are so beautiful. And they need to be explored. And it rejuvenate me just to be there. So even though it's difficult, but it's nice to go to the top of the mountain. Also, at the same time, you're really helping the local people who are trying to make a living. So when you go on a hike, you bring porters with you. You provide a living for people who struggle every day. So it's actually fun to do. And I don't think I can see myself resting and sleeping for the next working day, but I think it's really nice to do that kind of thing.
Well, and it's just when you read her book, which I encourage you to do, you'll just, this beauty in the rigorousness and the challenge of the land. It is the same challenge people are having that you're seeing in clinic and you're having as a provider, just a different piece of us. And your admiration, you're just kind of being in awe of the beauty is really, really an important piece of understanding you and who you are and how you do this work. I found it really impressive and moving, and will probably help me to push myself when I'm in Nairobi in 6 weeks, 2 months. I don't think I will go climbing, but I will look at other things that I can do more, because then my chips always get so tight. But I appreciate your attention to it in the book, because it weaves it, and you can imagine the sustenance it also gives you, just the different piece of it. And I think it's important. It's a beautiful part of the book, and it's important in how we understand what we need to make sure that we stay nourished. So I thank you for that piece. I'm going to see if there are any questions here. I see that Scott, you have a question that there's a more extended account of your book in Malaysia. You're coming out with a new book. Boy, you're really ambitious. The Girl Who Taught Herself to Fly. So it'll be coming out in October on Amazon. Thank you, Scott, for raising that. Are there any other questions, or we'll turn it over to Sandra to close? Okay, I think, Sandra, we're going to give it to you.
Thank you.
You are. Hi, now I see your face.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you so much, Dr. Lai, for just being with us here today. It's quite a privilege. Well, the statement that you said about Nelson Mandela and his service is also a statement that we have on our website. So I was very happy to hear you say that, to be remembered is not just by what you are, but what you do to people. So that was very nice to hear, Dr. Lai. I'm continuously very impressed by your fortitude and just the fact that you keep pushing, you inspire not only those who are in the medical field, but just general young people. And I'm very grateful for just the attitude to serve and not completely just looking for remuneration all the time. I was happy to hear about your journey, and I really wanted to know, do you really think that from the 7 years you are here, have there been anything, have there been any improvements? Do you think there's still hope? I think that's something that I would like to see or just know more about in another book, probably, that you may dedicate to us. Thank you, Jennifer, for hosting this conversation, for carrying it with so much grace, ensuring that The conversation flowed, the questions were being asked with much easiness and just so much knowledge about your field. And I'm grateful. And I hope in another setting, you may be able to come back and just host more talks with us, health-related topics, or even you yourself may release something on our platform. We will be very glad to have you here. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to our audience. Remember to follow us on social media. And till next time, I think this is goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.